Thomas Matthews noticed something odd happening in his home. Every Sunday, his mother Martha would visit their house with containers of homemade food. She always brought Thomas's favorite dishes from his childhood: rich meat stews, buttery potato casseroles, and sweet apple pies that filled the house with a warm, comforting smell. "I made extra so you and Elaine can enjoy it during the week," Martha would say as she filled their refrigerator with labeled containers. Her face would beam with pride as she arranged everything neatly on the shelves. Thomas loved his mother's cooking. It reminded him of growing up in their small family home, where food was how Martha showed her love. When he married Elaine 3 years ago, he had been excited for his wife to experience his mother's famous recipes. But something strange kept happening. Despite the refrigerator being full after Martha's visits, the food would disappear by Tuesday or Wednesday. At first, Thomas thought nothing of it. He assumed Elaine was enjoying the food while he was at work. "How was Mom's beef stew?" Thomas would ask Elaine during dinner. "It was delicious. I had it for lunch yesterday," Elaine would reply with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thomas noticed this pattern continuing week after week. His mother would drop off food, and it would vanish without him getting a chance to eat any. When he mentioned this to Elaine, she always had a ready explanation. "Oh, I'm sorry, honey. I didn't realize you wanted some. I'll save you a portion next time," Elaine promised. But somehow, the food always disappeared before he could have any. One Thursday evening, Thomas called his mother to thank her for the chicken pot pie she had brought over on Sunday. "Was it good? Did Elaine like it?" Martha asked eagerly. "Elaine said it was amazing. She finished it already," Thomas replied. There was a pause on the line. "That's funny," Martha said slowly. "When I called Elaine yesterday to ask if she enjoyed it, she said she hadn't tried it yet." A small seed of doubt planted itself in Thomas's mind. Why would Elaine lie about something so simple? The following Sunday, Martha arrived with her usual containers of food. Thomas noticed a certain tension in the air as Martha handed the containers to Elaine. "I added extra cheese to the pasta, just how you said you like it," Martha told Elaine. Elaine's smile looked forced. "Thank you, Martha. That's so thoughtful." Later that evening, after his mother had left, Thomas opened the refrigerator to grab a drink and saw all the containers neatly arranged on the middle shelf. He made a mental note to try some of the pasta for lunch tomorrow. But when Thomas opened the refrigerator the next day after returning from work, the pasta container was gone. The other dishes were still there, but the one he had specifically wanted to try had vanished. "Where's Mom's pasta?" Thomas asked Elaine as she prepared a simple salad for dinner. "Oh, I had it for lunch. It was delicious," Elaine replied without looking up from the cutting board. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Something didn't add up. "So you liked the extra cheese?" "Yes, it made it so creamy," Elaine said, still focused on chopping vegetables. Thomas remembered his mother's words clearly. There was no extra cheese. His mother had been testing Elaine, and she had failed. That night, as Elaine slept beside him, Thomas stared at the ceiling, troubled by thoughts racing through his mind. Was his wife lying about eating his mother's food? And if so, what was really happening to all those carefully prepared meals? Thomas knew he needed answers. What was really going on in his kitchen when he wasn't home? The next morning, Thomas woke up earlier than usual. He couldn't stop thinking about the missing pasta. As Elaine continued sleeping, he quietly made his way to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. He carefully checked each container his mother had brought. "That's strange," he whispered to himself. The beef stew container was nearly empty, with just a small portion left at the bottom. Thomas was certain it had been full yesterday. He hadn't eaten any, and Elaine hadn't mentioned having it for dinner. Thomas decided to look in the trash can. He carefully lifted the lid and peeked inside. What he saw made his heart sink. Under some paper towels was an empty container that looked exactly like the ones his mother used. He pulled it out and recognized Martha's handwriting on the label. "Beef stew, made with love." The container was clean, as if it had been rinsed before being thrown away. Thomas frowned. Why would Elaine wash the container and then throw it away instead of keeping it to return to Martha? Later that day at work, Thomas couldn't focus on his tasks. His mind kept returning to the empty container in the trash. Was Elaine really eating his mother's food, or was something else happening? That evening, Thomas decided to test his theory. During dinner, he casually mentioned his mother's cooking. "Mom's beef stew is always so good. Did you finish it today? He asked, watching Elaine's reaction carefully. Elaine nodded while twirling pasta around her fork. Yes, I had the last bit for lunch. It was delicious. Thomas took a deep breath. That's interesting. I found the empty container in the trash this morning. Elaine's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Her eyes widened slightly before she composed herself. Oh, yes. It was leaking a bit, so I had to throw it away. I meant to tell you. Thomas nodded, pretending to accept her explanation. But inside, his suspicions grew stronger. The container hadn't looked damaged at all. The following Sunday, Martha arrived with her usual array of home-cooked meals. Thomas noticed how Elaine's smile tightened when Martha handed her a container of lasagna. This is my special recipe, Martha said proudly. 3 different kinds of cheese and my secret sauce. I'm sure you'll love it, Elaine. It looks wonderful, Martha. Thank you, Elaine replied, her voice overly sweet. That night, after Elaine went to bed, Thomas checked the kitchen again. All of his mother's containers were still in the refrigerator. He made a small, barely noticeable mark on the bottom of each container with a marker. For the next 3 days, Thomas kept track of the containers. Each day, one would disappear while he was at work. When he checked the outdoor garbage bin, he found them buried deep inside, his small marks confirming they were his mother's containers. Even more troubling was that when he asked Elaine about the food, she always claimed to have eaten it and enjoyed it. Your mother's chicken was amazing today, she would say, describing details about a dish he couldn't possibly have tasted if the food was in the trash. On Thursday, Thomas received a call from his mother. How are you enjoying the meals this week? Martha asked. They're great, Mom, Thomas replied, feeling guilty about lying. And Elaine, does she like my cooking? Martha's voice held a note of doubt. She says she loves everything, Thomas answered carefully. That's odd, Martha said slowly, because when I called her earlier, she described my beef stew as having rosemary in it. I never use rosemary, Thomas. You know that. After hanging up, Thomas sat at his desk, his mind racing. The evidence was clear now. Elaine was lying about eating his mother's food. But why? What was really happening when he wasn't home? Thomas knew he needed proof. He needed to see what Elaine was doing with his mother's food with his own eyes. Sunday arrived again, and with it came Martha's weekly visit. Thomas watched the interaction between his mother and wife carefully. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Martha placed her containers on the kitchen counter one by one. I made your favorite pot roast, Thomas, she said with a smile, and I tried a new recipe for apple cobbler that I think you'll both love. Thank you, Mom. Everything looks delicious, Thomas said, helping her arrange the food in the refrigerator. Elaine stood by the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over her chest. Yes, thank you, Martha. You really shouldn't go to all this trouble every week. Martha's smile faltered slightly. It's no trouble at all. I love cooking for my family. After Martha left, Thomas noticed Elaine staring at the refrigerator with an unreadable expression on her face. When she caught him watching her, she quickly smiled and suggested they order pizza for dinner. Later that evening, as they ate pizza on the couch while watching a movie, Thomas decided to bring up the subject directly. Mom seemed a bit upset today, he said casually. Elaine kept her eyes fixed on the TV screen. Did she? I didn't notice. I think she wonders why we never eat her food when she's here, Thomas continued. She put so much effort into cooking for us. Elaine's jaw tightened. We do eat her food. I have it for lunch almost every day. Thomas took a deep breath. Elaine, I found Mom's containers in the outside trash bin. Several times now. The room fell silent. Even the movie playing in the background seemed to fade away as Elaine slowly turned to face him, her expression shifting from shock to anger. "You've been checking the trash?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I noticed the food was disappearing without me getting any," Thomas explained. "And then I found clean containers in the garbage. It didn't make sense." Elaine stood up abruptly, her face flushed. "So you've been spying on me, digging through garbage like some kind of detective?" "I just want to know what's happening to my mother's food," Thomas said, trying to stay calm. "Why would you throw it away and then lie about eating it?" "Your mother's food," Elaine shouted, throwing her hands up. "Always about your mother's precious food. Have you ever once asked me how I feel about these weekly food deliveries? About how your mother barges in here every Sunday with her containers and her judgmental looks. Thomas was taken aback by the sudden outburst. What are you talking about? Mom is just trying to be nice. Nice. Elaine laughed bitterly. She's marking her territory, Thomas. Every dish is a reminder that I'm not good enough for her precious son, that I don't cook the right way or keep house the right way. Thomas stood up too, confused by Elaine's interpretation. That's not true. Mom just loves cooking for us. For you, Elaine corrected him. She cooks for you, not for us, and every time she visits, she inspects our home like she's looking for evidence that I'm a terrible wife. Tears were streaming down Elaine's face now. Thomas reached up to comfort her, but she stepped away. You don't understand, she whispered. You never have. Before Thomas could respond, Elaine grabbed her keys and purse. Where are you going? Thomas asked, alarmed. To my sister's. I need some space, Elaine replied, heading for the door. After Elaine left, Thomas sat alone in the silent house, a half-eaten pizza growing cold on the coffee table. The situation had spiraled out of control, and he felt caught between the two women he loved most. Something wasn't adding up. Elaine's reaction seemed too extreme for what was happening. Was there something more to this story that he was missing? Thomas knew one thing for certain. He needed to know the truth, once and for all. Thomas spent a restless night on the couch after Elaine left. She hadn't returned his calls or text messages, only sending a brief text that read, "Staying at Lisa's tonight. Need time to think." As morning light filtered through the blinds, Thomas made a decision. He needed to see what was actually happening when he wasn't home. After a quick shower and breakfast, he drove to the electronics store that had just opened. "Can I help you find something?" asked a young sales clerk with a name tag that read Kevin. "I need a small camera," Thomas explained hesitantly. "Something that won't be easily noticed." Kevin showed him several options, and Thomas selected a small wireless camera that could be accessed remotely through his phone. It was no bigger than a deck of cards and could easily be hidden in the kitchen. "This one has motion detection," Kevin explained. "It will only record when it senses movement in the room, and it sends alerts to your phone." Thomas paid for the camera and hurried home. He felt guilty about installing a hidden camera in his own house, but he couldn't think of another way to resolve the situation. The conflict between Elaine and his mother was tearing their family apart. At home, Thomas carefully examined the kitchen, looking for the perfect spot to place the camera. He finally decided on the bookshelf that held their cookbooks. The small black device would blend in with the dark cookbooks and would have a clear view of the refrigerator. After setting up the camera and testing it with his phone, Thomas felt a mix of emotions. Part of him hoped that the camera would reveal nothing unusual, that there was some simple explanation for everything. But another part knew that whatever the camera captured would change things forever. Thomas called his mother later that afternoon. "Hi, Mom," he said, trying to sound normal. "I was wondering if you could bring over some of your special casserole tomorrow? The one with chicken and broccoli." "Of course, dear," Martha replied, sounding pleased. "Is everything okay? You sound tired." "Everything's fine," Thomas lied. "Elaine is visiting her sister for a day or two. Just some sister bonding time." "I see," Martha said, and Thomas could hear the doubt in her voice. "Well, I'll bring the casserole over tomorrow morning if that works for you." The next morning, Martha arrived with the casserole still warm from the oven. She looked around the kitchen, clearly noticing Elaine's absence but not mentioning it. "I made it just how you like it," she said, placing the glass dish on the counter, with extra cheese on top. "Thanks, Mom. It looks delicious," Thomas said, giving her a quick hug. After Martha left, Thomas placed the casserole in the refrigerator and checked that the camera was working properly. Then he left for work, his stomach in knots as he thought about what might happen while he was gone. Throughout the day, Thomas found it impossible to focus on work. He kept checking his phone, waiting for a motion alert from the camera. By lunchtime, nothing had happened. Thomas began to wonder if Elaine would stay away longer than he expected. Just after 2 p.m., his phone buzzed with an alert. Thomas quickly excused himself from a meeting and hurried to the empty break room. With shaking hands, he opened the app and began watching the live feed. The kitchen door opened, and Elaine walked in. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. She put her purse down on the counter and walked directly to the refrigerator. Thomas held his breath as she opened the door and stared at the contents inside. Elaine reached in and took out his mother's casserole dish. She placed it on the counter and stood looking at it for a long moment. Then, with a determined expression, she removed the lid. Thomas's heart raced as he watched what happened next. What Elaine did with the casserole would finally reveal the truth he had been seeking. Thomas's eyes were glued to his phone screen as he watched Elaine standing in their kitchen. She lifted the lid off his mother's casserole and stared at the contents for several long seconds. Her face showed a mix of emotions that Thomas couldn't quite read. Then, Elaine took a deep breath and grabbed a fork from the drawer. Thomas felt a moment of relief. Maybe she was actually going to eat the food. But instead of taking a bite, Elaine poked at the casserole cautiously, as if testing it. She then put the fork down and pulled out her phone. Thomas watched, confused, as Elaine took several photos of the casserole from different angles. She then typed something on her phone, her face serious and focused. What happened next left Thomas stunned. Elaine picked up the heavy glass dish and walked straight to the sink. Without hesitation, she tipped the entire casserole, his mother's special chicken and broccoli recipe with extra cheese, directly into the garbage disposal. No, Thomas whispered in the break room, not believing what he was seeing. On screen, Elaine turned on the disposal, the grinding sound visible in her wincing expression as she watched his mother's food disappear down the drain. She kept it running for nearly a minute, making sure everything was gone. Then she turned on the water and rinsed away any remaining traces. But what truly shocked Thomas was what happened next. Elaine opened a cabinet under the sink and pulled out a notebook. She flipped it open and wrote something down, checking her phone as she did so. Thomas could see her lips moving, as if she was talking to herself while she wrote. After putting the notebook away, Elaine thoroughly washed the glass dish with soap and hot water. She dried it carefully and placed it on the counter. Then she opened another cabinet and took out a can of chicken soup. She heated it in the microwave, poured it into a bowl, and took a few photos of it with her phone. Thomas watched in disbelief as Elaine ate the soup at their kitchen table, scrolling through her phone as she did. When she finished, she washed her bowl and spoon, then picked up Martha's now empty casserole dish. She stared at it for a moment before placing it in a reusable shopping bag. Thomas saw her check her watch, grab her purse, and leave the kitchen. The front door could be heard closing. Thomas sat frozen in the break room, struggling to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Why would Elaine destroy his mother's food so deliberately? What was she writing in that notebook? And where was she going with the empty dish? He checked the time, just after 3 p.m. Elaine should be at work, but clearly she had come home specifically to deal with his mother's casserole. This wasn't a spontaneous act, it was planned and methodical. Thomas called his boss and asked to take the rest of the day off, claiming a family emergency. 20 minutes later, he was in his car, driving toward home with his mind racing. The camera had revealed that Elaine was definitely throwing away his mother's food, but the situation seemed even more mysterious now. When he arrived home, Thomas went straight to the kitchen sink and opened the cabinet underneath. In the back corner, he found what he was looking for, a small notebook with a blue cover. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, he found page after page of detailed notes. Each entry included a date, a description of food his mother had brought over, and then a series of strange symptoms written in Elaine's neat handwriting. The most recent entry from today read, Martha's chicken and broccoli casserole. Extra cheese, she said. Suspicious white powder visible on top that wasn't cheese. Stomach pain and dizziness last time. Taking photos for Dr. Wilson. Disposed of food immediately. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as the horrifying truth began to dawn on him. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the blue notebook open in front of him. He flipped through page after page of Elaine's careful notes. Each entry described a different dish his mother had brought over, followed by detailed descriptions of symptoms Elaine claimed to have experienced after eating them. Martha's beef stew, severe stomach cramps within 30 minutes, vomiting at 2 a.m. Potato casserole, dizzy, heart racing, hands shaking. Had to leave work early. Apple pie, burning sensation in mouth, throat tightening, difficulty breathing. Took 2 allergy pills. Thomas couldn't believe what he was reading. According to these notes, his wife believed his mother was poisoning her. The idea was too horrifying to accept. Martha, who had raised him with such love and care, deliberately harming Elaine. It made no sense. The sound of a key in the front door pulled Thomas from his thoughts. He looked up to see Elaine entering the kitchen, still carrying the empty casserole dish in the shopping bag. She froze when she saw him sitting at the table with her notebook open. "What are you doing home?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted from Thomas's face to the notebook and back again. "I know you're throwing away my mother's food," Thomas said quietly. "I saw you." Elaine's face paled. "You were spying on me?" "I installed a camera," Thomas admitted. "I needed to know what was happening." He tapped the notebook. "And now I find this. You think my mother is poisoning you." Elaine set down the shopping bag and slowly approached the table. "Not think, Thomas. No." Her voice shook with emotion. "I've been sick after eating her food for months now." "That's impossible," Thomas argued. "My mother would never hurt anyone, especially not you." "She hates me," Elaine said, sitting down across from him. "She's always hated me. I'm not good enough for her perfect son." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "So you've been throwing away her food and lying about eating it? Taking pictures and keeping this poison diary?" "I started documenting everything after the third time I got sick," Elaine explained. "At first I thought it was just food poisoning or an allergy, but it only happened with her food, never with anything else I ate." "Where were you just now?" Thomas asked, nodding toward the shopping bag. Elaine hesitated before answering. "Dr. Wilson's office. I took a sample from today's casserole before I destroyed it. He's testing it." "You took food to be tested?" Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Do you know how crazy that sounds?" "Does this look crazy to you?" Elaine pulled out her phone and showed Thomas photos of angry red hives covering her arms and neck. "This was after her special birthday cake last month. I had to go to urgent care." Thomas stared at the photos, his certainty beginning to waver. The rash looked severe and painful. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. Tears filled Elaine's eyes. "I tried, Thomas. Remember when I suggested maybe we should cook our own meals on Sundays? You said I was trying to come between you and your mother. When I mentioned feeling sick after her food, you said it was all in my head." Thomas remembered those conversations but had never connected them to this situation. Had he been so blind to what was happening in his own home? "I need you to believe me," Elaine said, reaching for his hand across the table. "Something is wrong with your mother's food. I don't know if she's doing it on purpose or if she's just careless with ingredients I might be allergic to, but it's making me sick." Thomas looked into his wife's eyes, searching for the truth. The woman he loved was either suffering from dangerous delusions or was the victim of something unthinkable. "There's only one way to settle this," Thomas said finally. "We need to talk to my mother. Today, together." The drive to Martha's house was silent. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Beside him, Elaine sat still, clutching her blue notebook and staring out the window. The empty casserole dish rested on the back seat. "We're almost there," Thomas said, breaking the heavy silence. "What exactly are we going to say to her?" Elaine turned to face him. "The truth, that I've been getting sick after eating her food and we want to know why." Thomas nodded, still struggling to believe that his mother could be deliberately harming his wife. There had to be another explanation. Martha's small house came into view, its familiar front porch where Thomas had spent countless hours growing up. As they pulled into the driveway, Thomas noticed his mother peering through the curtains. By the time they reached the front door, Martha was already waiting for them. "Thomas, Elaine, what a nice surprise," Martha said, her smile faltering slightly when she noticed their serious expressions. "Is everything all right?" "We need to talk, Mom," Thomas said quietly. "It's important." Martha led them into her living room, the walls covered with family photos including several from Thomas and Elaine's wedding day. The three sat down, an uncomfortable tension filling the air. "Mom," Thomas began, "there's something we need to ask you about your food." Martha's eyebrows rose. "My food? What about it?" Thomas hesitated, finding it difficult to voice his thoughts. Elaine opened her notebook. "Martha, every time I eat something you cook, I get sick," Elaine said directly. "Sometimes it's stomach pain, sometimes it's hives, sometimes it's difficulty breathing." Martha's face registered shock. "What? That's terrible. But why didn't you say anything before?" "Because she thought you might be doing it on purpose," Thomas said. watching his mother's reaction carefully. Martha's hand flew to her chest. Doing what on purpose? Poisoning you? That's absurd. She looked genuinely horrified by the suggestion. I documented everything, Elaine said, showing Martha her notebook. It only happens with your food. Martha took the notebook with trembling hands and began reading through the entries. Her face grew increasingly pale. These symptoms, they sound like allergic reactions, Martha said slowly, looking up at Elaine. Do you have food allergies? Elaine nodded. Several. Severe ones. Nuts, especially peanuts and almonds. Also shellfish and certain food dyes. Martha closed her eyes briefly. Oh my God, she whispered. What is it, Mom? Thomas asked, leaning forward. My special chicken casserole, Martha said, her voice quivering. I always add a bit of almond flour to make the sauce thicker. And my beef stew has a splash of Worcestershire sauce, which contains anchovy paste. Thomas looked at Elaine in surprise. You never told me you had severe food allergies. Elaine's eyes filled with tears. Because the last time I told someone, they didn't believe me. What do you mean? Thomas asked. My mother, Elaine said quietly. She always said I was making up my allergies for attention. Even when I ended up in the hospital after eating a cookie she baked, she claimed I was just being dramatic. Martha reached across and took Elaine's hand. I would never, ever deliberately harm you, Elaine. I had no idea about your allergies. I should have told you, Elaine admitted. But after growing up with a mother who dismissed my medical needs, I was afraid you'd do the same. Then when Thomas always took your side, it felt like history repeating itself. Thomas felt a wave of shame wash over him. How had he missed something so important about his own wife? The white powder you saw on today's casserole, Martha explained, was almond flour mixed with Parmesan, not some poison. As understanding dawned on all their faces, the room fell silent. This wasn't a story of deliberate harm, but of harmful silence. Years of unspoken fears, untold medical conditions, and misunderstood intentions had created a dangerous situation that could have been avoided with simple communication. The three of them sat in Martha's living room, the truth finally revealed. Martha wiped tears from her eyes as she processed everything. I feel terrible, she said, looking at Elaine with genuine concern. All this time, I thought you were just being polite about my cooking. I never imagined it was making you sick. Elaine gave a small smile. And I thought you were trying to hurt me. We were both wrong about each other. Thomas sat between the two women, still trying to make sense of it all. I don't understand why neither of you talked to me about this, he said. I could have helped clear things up months ago. I tried to tell you something was wrong with your mother's food, Elaine reminded him gently. But you always defended her cooking so strongly. Thomas remembered those conversations differently now. What he had seen as Elaine trying to criticize his mother had actually been his wife trying to protect her health. Martha stood up suddenly. I have an idea. Come with me, both of you. She led them into her kitchen, a warm space filled with the tools and ingredients she had used to cook for her family for decades. She pulled out a large recipe box from a cabinet. These are all my recipes, Martha explained, placing the wooden box on the counter. Every dish I've ever made, including everything I brought to your house. Let's go through them together and mark which ones contain your allergens, Elaine. For the next hour, the three of them sat at Martha's kitchen table, going through recipe cards one by one. Elaine pointed out ingredients she couldn't eat, and Martha marked each card with a red dot. Nearly half of them have something I'm allergic to, Elaine said, surprised by the discovery. No wonder you've been getting sick, Martha said. But we can fix this. We can adapt these recipes. Thomas watched his mother and wife working together, feeling a mix of relief and regret. I'm sorry I didn't listen better, he said to Elaine. To both of you. The following Sunday marked a new beginning for their family. Instead of Martha arriving with prepared food, she came with grocery bags full of safe ingredients. The three of them spent the afternoon in Thomas and Elaine's kitchen, with Martha teaching them how to make her famous recipes with allergen-free substitutions. Almond flour can be replaced with rice flour, Martha explained as they prepared the chicken casserole together. It thickens just as well and won't make Elaine sick. As they cooked, they talked openly about the misunderstandings that had caused so much pain. Elaine shared stories of her childhood with a mother who refused to acknowledge her medical needs, helping Thomas and Martha understand why she had been so reluctant to speak up. Food was always complicated in my family, Elaine explained as she chopped vegetables. When Martha started bringing food every week, all those old feelings came rushing back. In my family, food was how we showed love, Martha said. I never imagined it could cause such harm. When they finally sat down to eat the meal they had prepared together, Thomas looked around the table with a grateful heart. The chicken casserole tasted different from his mother's original recipe, but watching Elaine eat without fear made it the best meal he'd ever had. I think this is the beginning of a new tradition, Thomas said, raising his glass in a toast. To honesty, to healing, and to family. Martha and Elaine raised their glasses too, the suspicion and fear that had divided them now replaced with understanding and respect. What had started as a mystery of disappearing food had revealed the deeper truth. That love without communication can sometimes cause harm, but when people speak honestly and listen with open hearts, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal.